Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about adult ADHD, and specifically we're going to be focusing on what ADHD looks like in adults, trying to get kind of a little bit of a more well-rounded kind of understanding of the ways that that can present and how that changes over the lifespan, and focusing on diagnosis, assessment, and screening, not so much focusing on treatment. So these are our learning objectives, and I'm hoping that we'll be touching on assessment process because that is really important. There's some key considerations for ADHD, but I also want to be really mindful of like how this can be as useful as possible for clinicians who aren't doing diagnostic assessment. So we'll be focusing on how can I screen in a practical way. Definitely, please feel free if you have questions at any point about what I'm saying or ways that this can be relevant for you, please throw them in the chat. And then if we have time at the end, we'll also, kind of open that up as well. So we're going to start by just getting a little refresher on the diagnostic criteria of ADHD in adults, and specifically with DSM-5, because that looks a little different than past versions. So just kind of broad overview, we consider ADHD to be a developmental disorder. So it begins early on in development, in early to middle childhood. And it's characterized by two main groups of symptoms, right? We have inattentive symptoms, and hyperactivity, impulsivity. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. So there's a persistent pattern of elevated symptoms in these domains. And in addition, symptoms have to be present by age 12, at least some of them. They have to be pervasive across settings, so they can't just happen at school, or they can't just happen in social settings, right? We want to see evidence that this is kind of across settings. There has to be clear evidence that these symptoms cause functional impairment in social, academic, or occupational functioning. And they cannot be better explained by another mental or medical condition. And that's going to be a big piece that we talk about today, because these kinds of symptoms are really not super specific to ADHD, actually. So we want to make sure that symptoms are not better explained by another kind of condition that's going on. There are 18 symptoms, 9 in each domain. And in order to meet criteria, an individual has to have at least 5 symptoms in one of the domains. So this can result in 3 diagnostic presentations. Not subtypes anymore, they're presentations, because they can shift a little bit over time. They're not as rigid as we once thought. So number 1, there's predominantly inattentive presentation, where somebody shows up and they have 5 or more inattentive symptoms, and they have 4 or fewer hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And when you hear people refer to it as ADD, this is what they're talking about, right? That kind of like daydreamy, mind-wandering, inattentive only kind of presentation. There's technically predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, which is the flip side of that, right? You have 5 or more hyperactive impulsive symptoms and fewer than 5 inattentive symptoms. In reality, this is a really uncommon presentation, especially in adults. It's extremely rare to meet criteria for ADHD without significant inattentive symptoms. Those really are a core feature of the diagnosis. So really, when we think about like, what does ADHD in adults look like, we have 2 kind of classic presentations. We have predominantly inattentive, or we have combined presentation. And combined presentation is where you have 5 or more inattentive and 5 or more hyperactive impulsive. So you've got significant in both. So you have the distractibility, and also you might have excessive talking or restlessness, things like that. In general, combined presentation is associated with higher rates of psychiatric comorbidity, greater severity, greater persistence from childhood into adulthood, as kind of a general rule. But they're also more likely to be diagnosed earlier and receive treatment earlier. So, we kind of mentioned those core groups of symptoms here, and just to give you a little bit of a taste of what, and just talk about a couple here. On the left, we've got inattention symptoms. And this is, the classic would be difficulty sustaining attention on a task and distractibility. Those are kind of the big two. They're the most common presenting symptoms in clinic referred adults for ADHD. And that distractibility, a key piece to keep in mind here is that it's a really broad distractibility. So it can be distractible by own thoughts. So kind of going down, on wild goose chases or going down rabbit holes, kind of tangential thinking and speaking. It can also be distractibility to external stimuli. So difficulty like getting distracted by the ticking of a clock or having a hard time tuning out conversations at the table next to you in a restaurant, right? This is not super specific to content, like we might see in some other disorders where we're maybe hypervigilant to, threat, for example. Forgetfulness in daily activities is another example of inattention. And in particular, this is going to be kind of persistent forgetfulness in things like paying bills, forgetting that you have appointments scheduled, and double booking or not showing. I had one person who told me that they bought concert tickets that were the same day as their sibling's wedding. So this is like daily activities and also like kind of big ones, just difficulty kind of keeping those things in mind and balancing that. Disorganization is another example, and I really wanted to talk about this one because when we think of disorganization, sometimes we think predominantly of messiness. But here again, disorganization is kind of broader than that. In particular, it's disorganization of activities, and that can mean things like difficulty prioritizing what you're going to do for the day, difficulty maintaining to-do lists, or kind of like freezing when you're trying to figure out. This also relates back to disorganized thoughts. So difficulty kind of prioritizing which thought is important or holding on to and kind of making sense of things. And so we'll kind of we'll come back to this kind of concept in a moment, but this is this broad disorganization, right? It can also look like difficulty organizing efficiently. So sometimes you have folks who spend a lot of time organizing and they say, oh, I'm really good at organizing. But really they're kind of like doing it over and over again and it's getting in the way of other things. Kind of moving over to the hyperactive impulsive side here, some examples from both of these kinds of words. The top two are kind of the classic hyperactive symptoms that people think about, right? Difficulty sitting still. In adults, this is much more likely to be an internal feeling of restlessness. Like I gotta move, I gotta do something, right? Although they are more likely to be able to like stay seated and things. This often presents as like squirming or shifting positions frequently in their seat. Fidgeting, right? Kind of classic. With impulsivity, again, hyperactive impulsive symptoms are less common, so some folks are not going to show these. And impulsivity in particular can look very different for lots of different people, especially as it's defined in the DSM. So just based on the DSM symptoms, we have things like blurting out answers before the question has been finished being asked, interrupting others when they're busy or intruding on other people in their conversation. What I hear a lot of folks kind of describe this as is like, I have to say something right now or I'm going to forget what I'm going to say, right? So there might be an awareness that someone's busy and still that like urgency of like, I have to interrupt right now. This is really important. Excessive talking too much in adults, this can be really masked and can contribute to like social anxiety later on, of like, I got so much feedback that I talked too much that now I just like bite my tongue and kind of really struggling internally with that. And then lastly, this symptom, which I have a personal issue with the DSM. I don't love it, but is always on the go as if driven by a motor. I think that was really hard to understand for folks. Like, what does that even mean? This is kind of referring to that classic hyperactivity of just excess energy. This could also look like kind of these bursts of activity of like, I'm going to spend all day cleaning my whole house and I'm going to go. And then kind of at the end of the day, when they stop, maybe at 3 a.m., kind of realizing like, oh crap, I was really tired or I haven't eaten all day, right? So kind of going as if driven by a motor, but it doesn't tend to be nearly as pervasive as in kids. So we'll come back to symptoms and some other kind of like descriptive presentations. I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview there, or a flavor of some of the DSM symptoms. Some other important background information for us to know and understand about ADHD. In terms of prevalence, this is somewhat, there's been a lot of controversy recently about like how prevalent is ADHD actually, all this kind of stuff, but the research is pretty consistent on this. In childhood, the prevalence of ADHD in childhood is about 5%. And in adults, there's more variation in the study results. It can range anywhere from 2 to 6%, most commonly. 4 seems to be where things are falling. So certainly not the most common disorder, but also not extremely rare. As far as persistence rates, now that's where the research really varies widely and is still in a very emerging place. We conceptualize ADHD as this developmental disorder, and people often talk about it like it's chronic and it lasts forever and this is how I am, which has truth to it and also is an oversimplification too. Depending on how we define ADHD in adulthood, especially with the most recent DSM criteria, previous studies have found huge variation, between 4 and 77%, which is absolutely useless information, right? However, the majority of studies seem to fall around the 50% mark as far as children with ADHD. About half of them will meet full criteria as adults. Important note is that most of these studies were conducted using DSM-4 criteria, which had a higher symptom requirement for adults. It required 6+ symptoms in a domain across the age span, and in DSM-5, that symptom criteria was reduced to 5 or more for adults. So we might see that change. Importantly, research shows that, okay, let's say half meet criteria, most of the remaining people will still have meaningful impairment and subclinical symptoms. So they might not meet full criteria, but they're still struggling with these areas of inattention. They're struggling with self-regulation, these kinds of things. So they could fall under the specifier in partial remission. And really there's kind of ongoing research of like, what does that actually mean? And we're trying to get a better understanding of what does the course look like. But still, there are some folks who do not have persistent problems into adulthood. They are able to they might be developmentally delayed, but then they're able to catch up by adulthood. It's a small group, and we shouldn't assume that that's going to be the case, because we should assume it's probably going to be the opposite when we talk to folks. Like many disorders, comorbidity is the rule, not the exception. Studies show upwards of 80% of adults with ADHD will meet criteria for another psychological disorder. The most common are anxiety disorders, depression, substance use problems, especially nicotine, alcohol, cannabis, and insomnia or sleep problems. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of adults with ADHD have significant problems with sleep, so it's a really big area of concern.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I was just curious about the anxiety disorders, which ones, if there are some that stand out more than others?
That is a great question that I honestly, I don't have the research on hand. I don't know the clear evidence for that. What my educated guess would be, number one, the more common anxiety disorders, right? Social anxiety, for example. But I would also think social anxiety, just because of the lived experience of having ADHD, where you often get a lot of negative feedback from people about being annoying or not meeting your potential, or you do something silly or you blurt out, right? One thing we see in kids with ADHD, and we see this with kids in general, but especially kids with ADHD have pretty poor insight about their behaviors and symptoms. And so they often don't realize the way that others are perceiving them until like adolescence. And because of the developmental delay, they realize that a little bit later than their peers might. And so it can be a real like revelation or a shock, like, oh crap, oh my gosh, I've been annoying this whole time and everybody hates me, right? And so social anxiety, depression can be kind of common after effects from that. But there are connections between ADHD and things like OCD and GAD. For example, the difficulty inhibiting thoughts or shifting attention is certainly implicated in both. All right. Okay, so then, good question. So what does ADHD look like across the lifespan, right? We kind of got a little taste of these symptoms, but it's really important for us to understand, you know, ADHD is a developmental disorder. It's present from a very young age. It impacts folks across development. It impacts the process of development. And it changes over development, right? So the symptom expression can look different. And so I think this is such an excellent graphic here of how the ADHD symptoms commonly change over time. So kids with ADHD, you're more likely to see these overt symptoms of hyperactivity, being obviously like easily distracted, right? And kind of bouncing between things, interrupting others, often out of their seat, right? And you'll see a lot of the careless errors that's more visible in kids much of the time. This varies by individual, but this kind of goes back to that a similar kind of piece with the social anxiety, where over time you realize like, oh, I make a lot of careless errors, and so I'm going to try to overcompensate for that and spend a lot of time checking my answers and be nervous about that. So for some folks, they develop that pattern, but we definitely still see that in adulthood. As people get older, they transition into adolescence. You know, we see more risky behavior. That restlessness becomes a little more internalized, less overt. We see more kind of fighting back against authority figures. Difficulty with relationships, emotion regulation becomes a big issue. You might be thinking, hey, a lot of these are really common in teens in general. And you would be right. And we'll come back to that in just a second, because that's an important piece here. But what we see with teens with ADHD is more severity here. Again, a little bit more of a developmental delay of being behind that. In adulthood, we see things shift even more, right? We're much less likely to see overt hyperactivity, but we see things like disorganization, difficulty with long-term planning, or just failing to plan ahead. A lot of folks with ADHD are kind of constantly putting out fires, and feel like they can never really make, or they never do kind of make long-term plans. Forgetfulness, losing things, right? You no longer have parents making sure like, hey, do you have your backpack? And checking in. You're responsible for organizing and keeping up with all your own stuff. You also see a lot more like time management problems pop up and become more of an issue. And you see it play out in, you know, jobs and relationships, right? You know, adults with ADHD are more like have higher rates of separation and divorce. They have more frequent job changes, you know, with impulsivity and also with the impairment of ADHD symptoms in the workplace. So there's this kind of overall theme of some of the most observable symptoms decrease: hyperactivity, impulsivity. The inattentive symptoms don't necessarily decrease. And oftentimes, although symptoms may decrease, impairment increases because you're expected to regulate yourself a lot more in adulthood, right? You don't have the supports that you do from school, from parents, right? There's a lot more that you have to manage and organize and plan for. And so it can become more impairing even as the symptoms become less intense. And so what we see is that, you know, symptom criteria was developed based on kids, and it's been modified, but it's still predominantly based on kids. And when we look at the research in adults, we see pretty consistently that adults have a much more diverse set of deficits in executive functioning and emotional control than kids do, that those seem to be more common. And so this is a really important piece to understand or to conceptualize ADHD, is, you know, it's not a deficit of attention. The name is not ideal. It's kind of imprecise. It is really a deficit of attention regulation. When we think about ADHD, it is a developmental disorder of impaired self-regulation. So in ideal circumstances, when someone with ADHD is really interested in something, or where they're under time pressure, whatever, they can focus really well often, right? In fact, sometimes folks complain of difficulties with focusing too well, hyperfocus, right? Where they're stuck doing an Excel spreadsheet until 3 a.m, and they don't hear when their partner comes in and says they're going to bed. They don't stop and eat breakfast or dinner or whatever time of day I'm going with this example, right? Because it's not a deficit of attention, it's a deficit in the ability to regulate attention, to shift, to move it to where I want it to be, to check in with myself, to pay attention to those internal cues, right? And so that's why you see both persistent distractibility and low levels of attention, and also these bursts of high focus or difficulty prioritizing or working efficiently because they're like stuck on this one thing, right? As I mentioned before, many adults with ADHD don't have hyperactive symptoms, and yet that's in the name. Many kids with ADHD don't have hyperactive symptoms. The name also does not describe some of these key problems with organization, with procrastination, with time management, with starting and completing tasks, which really are a core component of the conceptualization, and many of these are reflected in the diagnostic criteria. It doesn't even include impulsivity, even though that's kind of the other piece of that hyperactivity domain. And another kind of aspect that's currently not in the diagnostic criteria is emotion dysregulation. One of the ways that this kind of difficulties with inhibition and impulsivity can play out is really emotional lability. So you might see low frustration tolerance. You might see excitability, like when they're happy, they're like really happy, and then that can like shift. This especially comes up with shifting tasks, for example, or other things that are kind of implicated in the ADHD symptoms. Difficulty regulating emotions can add on to, or may even be a core feature of some of the avoidance and procrastination that we see. So some researchers argue that it should be considered a core feature of ADHD. It's important to note that this does not mean that everyone with ADHD has difficulties with emotion regulation, or even the majority. It does seem to be a subset that struggle with this, but it is a consistent pattern that we're seeing, and that can show up. So the kind of big piece here that I want to emphasize is that again, it's not a deficit; it's a deficit of regulation. And so this big idea, if I were to sum up what ADHD is ADHD is a developmental disorder of impaired self-regulation. And so what we'll see, this ADHD iceberg is a really common metaphor that's used in a lot of like ADHD communities online, because it reflects this really well. Is on the surface, we think about and we see some of these more observable or classic kind of ADHD symptoms. But those symptoms are really driven by underlying deficits in self-regulation, in executive functioning, right? And those deficits have really wide-ranging impacts, right? So that It includes like transitioning to a bedtime routine at a regular time, or initiating a task, or recognizing that your attention has shifted, right? There's a big theme in ADHD of, well, I can do the thing, I just can't do the thing consistently, right? I know I can do this. It's so frustrating because I know, like, and I know that I'm doing it still, but I just keep kind of falling back in this pattern. And so you can often see this kind of cycle play out where folks with ADHD will do really well at something. They'll get all in on something, the start of a new semester or a new job or a new hobby. They'll kind of go all in, and this is the focus, because there's difficulty prioritizing, organizing, shifting to other things, right? And then that kind of burns out, and then they start struggling, right? That all or nothing. So you might see, going back through the history, periods of functioning well, and then the fallout happens, right? Well, I did amazing at my job at first, but then I started missing details, or then I got bored, or whatever. The impairment pattern can be consistently inconsistent, but the symptoms should be pervasive and persistent across time. Any questions about any of that? Okay. Executive functioning is a really big term that's been defined a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this graphic really, but I just wanted to throw it up here just to help get an understanding of some of the ways that executive functioning can play out and impact ADHD. And so this kind of slide is up here as a reference for recording. And you can see kind of all these different areas that these executive functioning or these self-regulation deficits are impacting. And so it makes a lot of sense that we see the kind of global impairments that we see in folks with ADHD. One thing that I wanted to note, and this goes back to earlier when I was like, oh, hey, these look like common things for teens in general. These kinds of symptoms, difficulty concentrating, disorganization, forgetfulness, procrastination, these things are really common in human experience, right? They're part of being human. Most people, in my anecdotal experience, don't, especially non-psychologists, don't have a good understanding of how fallible human attention is, how limited it is, right? And so this is really important to understand and to help clients understand, is that, like, yeah, we all are distractible. We all have problems with procrastination. And usually our own metric is not the greatest liability. What kind of sets ADHD apart is it is a quantitative difference in frequency, severity, and persistence. So we have this spectrum of normative attention, self-regulation, functioning, and folks with ADHD are going to fall in that really low end of the spectrum. So they're having more of these problems, they're experiencing more impairment from these problems, and the problems are lasting longer than would be expected. Or they might be, so again, that developmental piece, kids are hyperactive, kids are impulsive, kids are distractible. You'll see a kid with ADHD is more and doesn't grow out of it as fast, typically. It is not a qualitative difference in course or presentation. These things look the same as they do for other humans, and they occur relatively the same timeline, just a little delayed, more severe, right? And it should be a noticeable difference. So we said earlier, ADHD is a 4 to 5% prevalence. So we should expect that folks with ADHD, adults with ADHD, are, in that 5th percentile in terms of attention regulation and self-regulatory functioning. So that they should be really kind of struggling and should be causing some impairments. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just wanted to give a sense that, you know, this is a developmental disorder, so it affects people from a very young age across development, across settings. The self-regulation piece is a core underlying deficit. And so what we see in how it can impair people is really that impairment can show up in, as Ramsey puts it, basically any category of human functioning, because this is something that they're taking with them all the time, right? The big areas we tend to see, the most notable ones are certainly academic and work. So kids with ADHD are less likely to go to college. They're less likely to graduate from college. They have lower financial attainment. They're more likely to be fired or to have frequent job changes. It impacts relationships, romantic relationships. And there's also huge health and well-being risks. So more risky behaviors and accidental injuries. Kids with ADHD have ER bills. Families spend twice as much over the course of the child's lifetime on ER bills than for kids without ADHD. So it's like huge differences. And driving is a particular area of concern, as well as these like medical comorbidities, right? Difficulty, with eating routines. We see things like unplanned pregnancies and obesity at higher rates. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that impact of living with ADHD is a significant part that we're realizing now. So I'm just going to show a brief clip from the wonderful movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. It's very weird, but it's great. And when I was watching it, I mean, like, I immediately was like, this is a woman living with undiagnosed ADHD, because that's my lens. And it turns out one of the writers really, like, through the course of creating this character, ended up getting diagnosed with ADHD himself, and very much intentionally wrote Evelyn as a depiction of an adult with ADHD. And so there are a lot of themes that are really important in the movie related to that. But I think even just this brief clip, we can kind of see some key pieces here. Oh, let me stop sharing and reshare with audio.
Mrs. Wang, are you with us?
Yes. Of course, I'm here. Just thinking.
Oh, okay. Well. Hello? Look, I'm sure you have a lot on your mind, but I cannot imagine anything mattering more than the conversation we are now having concerning.
Anybody want to shout out or throw in the chat like things that they saw that reflected some of the symptoms and difficulties we've been talking about? No one's feeling brave today. That's fine.
I think, Martha, maybe you said something, but you're muted, or maybe not.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting distracted by the reflection in the mirror. The organizational difficulties are huge. The overwhelm. Fixated on the bills is a really good point. Like you see her, she's here and she doesn't even know the son's in the room until he like rips the paper from her hands, right? You see her fidgeting with her shoes there. And just some context here in the movie, like they're in the office because she hasn't like submitted taxes, right? So huge difficulties staying organized and following through on these really important tasks, even despite these huge consequences, right?
And also the piece, I'm sure you hear this a lot, Christie, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. This idea that like, I must sort of have everything that's important like in view, because if it's in a file folder or a shut kitchen cabinet or another room, it's like that thing does not exist for me. So I have to keep everything in view to remember it exists, but also that's a really overwhelming way to live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That can be an effective strategy when it's like followed through and maintained really well, but when everything is visible all at once, then things lose their significance, right? Nothing is meaningful. I did want to go back to a point Katie made earlier in the chat about impairment, which I think is such an important one. Thank you for bringing this up. So that symptoms persist, impairment fluctuates, and one thing we often see is that impairment can fluctuate from domain. So I'm doing really amazing in school, but I'm completely neglecting my self-care and relationships, right? Because like I can only do this one thing. I can't shift, I can't prioritize, right? That difficulty. And so we'll see that. Another important piece to think about is the relationship between impairment and expectations. So I kind of touched on this with the developmental differences, but we might see less impairment because they're getting a lot of support or informal accommodations from others in their lives. So their partner might do all the household management or tell them what to do, right? They might have a really accommodating boss who sends them a bunch of reminders. If they grew up with really involved helicopter parents or super active parents, we might not see that academic impairment. Or if they have some really, key strengths here, like we see this a lot with gifted folks of just kind of like powering through. So they'll still have difficulty completing assignments or bringing them in or organizing them, but because of their high IQ, they're able to do really well on the tests and still like do well in school. It just causes a ton of effort and energy to do so. So let me share screen again without audio this time. So, okay, so now we've got an overview of what ADHD can look like and kind of this concept of these core deficits in executive functioning and self-regulation that underlie that. It's really important for us to get an understanding of what else interferes with attention and executive functioning, because ADHD is far from the only thing that does. So this is kind of a brief list of some of the things that can cause problems with attention, focus, distractibility, that can cause problems with task completion, avoidance, motivation, and just ability to kind of self-regulate and prioritize things. We're gonna touch on these in a minute. So this is kind of an overview here, and we'll walk through some of these in more detail right now. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive on a couple of the disorders that are most common and are most likely to kind of show up and cause confusion with folks coming in. Maybe they've seen on TikTok and they're like, I resonate with a lot of these things. And what we want to really pay attention to in terms of screening a differential diagnosis, right? So on this table, we've got the similarities with ADHD, and we're going to kind of walk through these different disorders. The first one intentionally, is anxiety. Anxiety is a big one. It causes problems with inattention, difficulty concentrating, racing thoughts, right? Because these are higher order cognitive functions, your body's going to prioritize the lower order stuff when we don't have enough resources. So if my body is saying I'm under threat and there's danger, it's not prioritizing thinking about the future, right? It's not prioritizing planning. It's focusing on like, we gotta alert for threat and stay focused on threat. And so that makes it really difficult to focus on other things, right? Your attention's kind of constantly split. We also see sometimes with anxiety, right? Restlessness for sure. We see irritability. We might see folks with elevated physiological arousal being really fidgety, which can look like hyperactivity, right? But there's some key differences that we can keep in mind and look for here. Number one, anxiety, somatic symptoms are huge, and that's not an inherent part of ADHD or a core feature. You're also going to see persistent fear and worry and anxiety, and it's really important to get a sense of that kind of, what's that rumination look like? When you say you worry about everything, get a little bit more detail, because sometimes adults with ADHD will say like, oh yeah, I worry about everything, because their mind's kind of bouncing around. And especially if they've developed a strengthened anxiety response as a coping mechanism, right? I'm going to worry about all of the things that I have to do, because otherwise I will forget them and not get them done. So you can see comorbidity, or you can see just like subclinical worry there. But with anxiety, typically the thought content is going to be more specific, whereas with ADHD, the distractions are much wider ranging. The disorganization of thoughts is much wider ranging. So someone might have difficulty falling asleep due to worry, because they're like ruminating and thinking, what if? Or somebody with ADHD might also be ruminating about like, oh, I need to do this, or what if I don't have time? And then they also might be kind of going down all these like elaborate rabbit holes about what they read on Wikipedia that day, or you're just going to see a broader array, right? A really important piece about anxiety that really complicates screening and diagnosis of ADHD here is that elevated anxiety increases self-reported ADHD symptoms. There's a study, I don't have the site here, I could look it up for those who are interested, but that looked at like discrepancies between self-reported symptoms and symptoms as rated by like partners and parents of adults. And anxiety symptoms was the biggest predictor of that discrepancy. So you have folks who are really anxious about myself, about what I'm doing, about like, am I good enough? Are people going to judge me harshly? Whatever. They're more likely to report high levels of symptoms that others in their lives don't really see. Depression also has overlap. You'll see this commonality here. Difficulty concentrating is like, it's the fever of the psychological world. Like everything causes problems concentrating, right? So that's not super specific. With depression, you might also see irritability, which can look like that emotional lability in ADHD. You might see psychomotor agitation. I haven't seen a ton of that personally. But then really with depression, the overlap here is with this broader like executive dysfunction and just like general activities of daily living. So with depression, you get a lot of indecisiveness, not pulling the trigger on anything, not moving forward, kind of waffling, which can mimic some of the task paralysis or difficulty organizing thoughts and activities. You have low motivation, which can certainly impair our ability to start tasks or work on them. and just difficulty getting up out of bed or doing hygiene routines, all that kind of good stuff. The key differences that we would want to look for here is depression typically is going to have an episodic course, right? Obviously there are exceptions, but that's a really big indicator. If these problems with attention are only occurring while there's also mood disturbance, that's a big flag that, okay, that's not ADHD, that's something else. Depression tends to have a later age of onset. And these, symptoms with depression, the low mood, the low energy, the low motivation, we're really going to see those more persistently during the course of an episode. So they're there most of the day, nearly every day for 2 weeks. For folks with ADHD without comorbid depression, we're going to see variable motivation typically, right? Like I'm really interested in something and I'm not at all interested. I'm really bored. I just, that on and off switch, right? You might have low energy and then one day have like a ton of energy and get a bunch of stuff done. And more that emotional ability is that up and down, not persistent low. It's really important to assess for mania. We'll touch on this in a second because bipolar disorder is really difficult to differentially diagnose with ADHD and can really look a lot like comorbid ADHD and a depressive disorder there. And then the last one here that I want to highlight in detail is PTSD, so difficulty concentrating and exaggerated startle response can look like distractibility, right? We see reckless behavior, which can mimic impulsivity, irritability, and lack of interest in things. So that low motivation can make it really difficult to start tasks or to do things that need to be done. But there's some big differences here, probably more than in other areas. I mean, the key indicator is did these symptoms start after a traumatic event, right? If so, that's not ADHD, right? That's probably PTSD. The intrusive thoughts tend to be more specific, trauma related. Also, the mood alteration symptoms that we see in PTSD are not part of ADHD. And the sleep disturbances, the quality of those are different, right? More related to like nightmares and things than difficulty maintaining a consistent sleep routine. For folks who have experienced pervasive adverse childhood experiences and multiple experiences of trauma from childhood, that makes differential diagnosis a lot trickier because that can lead to chronic self-regulation deficits, and we can't necessarily prove change from baseline. So that's going to be one where we're going to want to do a really thorough assessment. Kind of moving a little quickly here just for time, but some additional differential diagnoses to consider and keep in mind. As I mentioned, bipolar disorder can be really tricky, especially with hypomania, to differentially diagnose. So we want to make sure to screen for mania and hypomania. I mean, that's good practice in general when we have somebody presenting with mood problems, but the presence of any of these specific features are pretty big keys that it's bipolar disorder. There may or may not also be comorbid ADHD, but importantly, that decreased need for sleep is a key feature. With adults with ADHD, they might get decreased sleep, but they're going to still feel more tired, right? With borderline personality disorder, there's the impulsivity, the emotional ability, angry outbursts, but these more severe symptoms here, the suicidality, the intensity of the relationship disturbance, and abandonment, none of those are indicated in ADHD. And then substance use problems, this is another really important one to screen for. Acute drug use and withdrawal both can lead to symptoms that mimic ADHD, and also heavy use in the past is associated with cognitive impairments that can mimic ADHD. So we want to get a clear indicator of their substance use history, as well as evaluating the onset of their ADHD related symptoms, because substance use problems are really comorbid with ADHD. There's also a bunch of medical mimics that can look like ADHD, sleep problems. Menopause is a big one that people don't realize. There's a subset of people who go through menopause who report the the onset of really significant difficulties that look a lot like ADHD. And the treatment, in terms of pharmaceuticals, the treatment actually may be the same, but again, it's not that same developmental course. And so there's no such thing as adult onset ADHD. Some other important medical conditions to keep in mind: thyroid problems, which is a big one just for psychological comorbidity in general. But also, head injuries, diabetes, lead toxicity, all of these things can make people appear more distractible, can make it difficult to listen in conversations, right? There's a lot of complexity here. There's also non-pathological contributors to difficulties with attention and regulation: life stress, being a new parent, going through a global pandemic. And a big one that I see a lot is these overly high expectations. So if you have super high expectations for your own functioning and you start having problems, this often happens for college students who have done extremely well through high school, and now they're going into a difficult program or a difficult graduate degree, and they start feeling like they're not meeting those demands. That could be because they're kind of at the limit of what would be expected for their intellectual functioning. Like, yep, that's going to be hard, because that's hard for most people. So again, considering that course and onset is really important. I want to make sure to get to the screening here. So I'm just going to kind of go through these. So already laid out, like, diagnosing ADHD in adults can be challenging for a lot of different reasons. And so gold standard is to do a comprehensive diagnostic assessment to evaluate for current symptoms, to look at childhood symptoms, to look at impairment, and to rule out other possible better explanations. So the kind of components of that gold standard would be a comprehensive clinical interview. We also want to collect self-report of current and childhood symptoms and impairment. And it's also really important to try to get collateral report. What do other people in their lives see? So people who knew them in childhood and people who know them now. Really, really important. And if possible, it rarely is possible, but if we can get academic records or like workplace performance feedback, that's really key too. Most ADHD assessments involve neuropsychological testing. This can rule out learning disabilities or other cognitive and memory problems. It also gives us performance validity measures, but it's important to know that they're not diagnostic of ADHD. Even tests like the continuous performance test, the CPT, which is marketed as an ADHD diagnostic tool, really isn't, especially in adults. Because again, we want to see that consistent inconsistency. And so folks with ADHD can do really well some of the time. Skipping ahead here to, okay, y'all are going to do that. What can you do in your actual day-to-day clinical practice with folks in general or folks who come in with concerns like, hey, I think I might have ADHD. So 3 kind of questions that you might consider asking, and you could ask this of all clients at intake or just those who express ADHD concerns. If they have a diagnosis, a history of diagnosis, we want to know that and ask. Do any family members have ADHD? Because it is hugely genetic. So that's a good indicator that, okay, it increases the likelihood. And again, is there this lifelong history of these chronic problems? And we want to screen for some of these other areas I touched on previously. I would also recommend administering a standardized screener to assess for ADHD. This is actually in the PSM forms online, the ASRS. It's only 6 items. It's super fast. And 4 or more would indicate like, okay, we want to take a little bit of a deeper dive here and see, what's going on here. There's some additional questions if you want to do more. These 2 have really good sensitivity and specificity. I'm expecting that folks are not going to be interested in that. So if you are interested, I'm happy to meet or consult at any time and go through that in more detail. I want to make sure we end on time here. And actually that is my last slide. So I think we have like a minute or two if folks have any questions.
I have a question, Christy. I know we're kind of at the end of time, so maybe I can ask you offline, actually.
Okay. Dave, did you have your hand raised? Oh, thank you.
Also, no questions, but thank you, Christy. That was great. I learned a lot.
Okay, good. I am always happy to talk more about ADHD. I know we kind of covered a lot in a little bit of time, so I'm happy to follow up if anybody has any questions or wants to chat more about anything, you know, later on. So Heather, for sure, hit me up. Happy to.
Yeah. So thank you all for being here after our little hiatus in July. Next month, we have Zoe Brokos from the Church of Safe Injection, who will be talking about harm reduction. So hope to see many of you there. Very glad that folks have signed up for the conference next month. Keep filling out the form if you haven't signed up yet. I'll send another reminder. And we'll see you in September. Oh, September.